Every day, more than 100,000 people pass through the world's busiest airports. Some are heading home after weeks away. Some are beginning the adventure of a lifetime. Others are saying goodbye, perhaps for the last time. For almost everyone, an airport is nothing more than a place in between. A few hours, a boarding pass, a gate number, then they leave. But one man never did. For 18 years, he woke up beneath fluorescent lights instead of a bedroom ceiling. He watched thousands of flights take off without ever boarding one. Passengers came and went. Airlines changed their logos. Governments changed. Technology transformed the world. Yet every morning, he was still there, sleeping on the same benches, reading the same newspapers, waiting. His name was Mehran Karimi Nasseri, and his story is so unbelievable that millions of people know a fictional version of it, without ever hearing what really happened. This is not simply the story of a man trapped inside an airport. It is the story of borders, identity, bureaucracy, and a question that most of us never have to ask. What happens when no country will let you belong? The story begins in 1988. Nasseri had spent years trying to build a new life in Europe after leaving Iran. Like many refugees of the time, his journey was complicated by immigration laws, political decisions, and paperwork that determined where he could legally stay. While traveling through Europe, he eventually arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport, just outside Paris. What happened next would change the rest of his life. According to Nasseri's own account, documents proving his identity and refugee status were lost during his journey. Without them, airline officials refused to let him continue. At the same time, French authorities could not simply admit him into the country under normal procedures. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't free to continue his journey either. Instead, he found himself in a place that was never meant to become someone's home: the airport's international transit zone. At first, everyone believed it would only be temporary. A few days, maybe a week. Surely, someone would resolve the paperwork. Someone would find a solution. But days became weeks. Weeks became months. And months quietly turned into years. The airport continued to function exactly as it always had. Flights departed every few minutes. Families reunited. Business travelers rushed from one gate to another. Children stared through the windows as airplanes rolled toward the runway. Life never stopped moving, except for one man. For Nasseri, time seemed to stand still. The transit terminal slowly became something no architect had ever intended it to be: a home. He slept on airport benches, using his few belongings as both luggage and furniture. His clothes were carefully folded beside him. His notebooks were stacked neatly. Every object had its place, because this small corner of the terminal was the only place in the world he could truly call his own. Airport employees began to recognize him. Cleaning crews greeted him every morning. Security officers knew exactly who he was. Restaurant workers occasionally offered him food. To many travelers, he was simply part of the airport itself, like the departure boards, the information desks, or the endless announcements echoing through the halls. As the years passed, Nasseri developed a daily routine. He woke early. He washed in the airport restrooms. He spent hours reading newspapers from around the world. He carefully documented his thoughts in notebooks, recording the passing days, the people he met, and the strange reality of a life lived entirely inside a building designed for people who were only supposed to stay a few hours. Outside, the world changed faster than anyone could have imagined. The Berlin Wall disappeared. The internet connected billions of people. Mobile phones became everyday objects. New generations of aircraft entered service. Entire countries transformed. But inside the terminal, another ordinary day simply began. Passengers looked at departure screens. Boarding calls echoed overhead. Suitcases rolled across polished floors. And in the middle of it all, Mehran Karimi Nasseri quietly waited. Not because he wanted to, but because leaving was far more complicated than staying. His story became a quiet reminder of how powerful a single document can be. A passport, a visa, a refugee certificate, pieces of paper that most people rarely think about until the day they no longer have them. Without them, crossing a border can become impossible. Without them, even freedom can begin to feel like a place just beyond a locked door. As the years passed, something unexpected began to happen. The man who had spent so long trying not to be noticed became impossible to ignore. Travelers started asking questions. Who is that man? Why is he always here? Airport employees told the story again and again. Soon, journalists arrived. Then, photographers. Then, documentary filmmakers. The man who had once been stranded in silence was suddenly known around the world. Newspapers called him the man who lived at the airport. Television crews interviewed him. His extraordinary life fascinated millions of people, not because he had achieved fame or fortune, but because his existence challenged something most of us take for granted: the freedom to leave. By then, Charles de Gaulle Airport had become more than just a place on a map. It had become part of his identity, a place where every hallway was familiar, every announcement sounded routine. Every sunrise arrived through the same enormous windows overlooking the runways. Years earlier, leaving the airport had been his greatest hope. Now, after so much time had passed, the idea of leaving had become far more complicated. Then, Hollywood came calling. In 2004, director Steven Spielberg released a film called The Terminal, starring Tom Hanks. Millions of viewers assumed they were watching the true story of Mehran Karimi Nasseri. But they weren't. The film was inspired by elements of his life, not a recreation of it. In the movie, the story becomes hopeful, humorous, and romantic. The real story was very different. There was no cinematic adventure, no love story, no perfect ending. Instead, there were years of uncertainty, legal complications, and endless waiting. Perhaps that's what makes the real story even more remarkable. Because, unlike fiction, real life rarely follows a script. Eventually, after living inside the airport for nearly 18 years, Nasseri's time in the terminal came to an end. In 2006, deteriorating health required him to leave the airport and receive medical care. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, he slept somewhere else. The benches that had become his bedroom were empty. The familiar faces of airport staff carried on with their work. Passengers continued rushing toward departure gates. And, almost overnight, the airport returned to being just an airport. A place we can't wait to leave. We complain about delayed flights, long security lines, and uncomfortable seats. Then, a few hours later, we walk away. Mehran Karimi Nasseri never had that choice. For nearly 18 years, the world passed by just a few meters away. Every departure reminded him of a journey he couldn't take. Every arrival reminded him that everyone else belongs somewhere. His story has often been described as strange. But perhaps it isn't strange at all. Perhaps it simply reveals how fragile our freedom really is. A passport is only a small booklet. A visa is only a stamp. A few official documents can seem insignificant until the moment they determine where you are allowed to exist. In 2022, Mehran Karimi Nasseri returned once again to Charles de Gaulle Airport. not as a traveler, not as a refugee, but as the man whose life had become inseparable from that place. It was there, inside the same airport that had defined almost 2 decades of his life, that he passed away. His journey ended where the world had first come to know his name. Millions of people remember the Hollywood movie. Far fewer remember the real man behind it. A man who spent 18 years waiting, not for fame, not for money, but for something most of us already have, a place to belong. Because in the end, home is not always a house. Sometimes, it's simply the place where the world finally allows you to exist. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to Memory of Light for more forgotten stories that change the world. Because history isn't only written by kings, presidents, or generals. Sometimes, it's written quietly by a man sitting alone on an airport bench.